Welcome to Afros and Audio's Black History Month interview series. My name is Talib Jasir, founder and CEO of Afros and Audio Podcast Festival and the Vanguard Podcast Network. I'm excited to spotlight 29 outstanding indie podcast creators and professionals who answered the call to be a part of the series. My guest today is Marisa Ewing. Welcome and thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have a conversation with you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited too. So here we go. All right. So you are an audio professional who wears many hats. I know that because that's what audio professionals do. And I too wear many hats. So could you share your journey into becoming, I'm going to throw some of them out there. I know it's not all. Dialogue editor, sound designer, mixing, mastering engineer. How did you transition into these roles and into the audio professional world in general?
Yeah, so it's definitely been quite the journey. I originally started out wanting to be a composer for film. I really wanted to do movie scoring, was really inspired by artists like Hans Zimmer, and was like, this is what I'm going to do. Great. So I went to college and I wanted to get a music degree, but decided to double major in audio production because I thought it would be a good skill to be able to accurately describe the recording process, give notes on how I wanted my recordings to be made, things like that. And basically through the course of college, while I still do like composing and do a little from time to time, I realized that I like the production aspects a lot more than the composition aspects. And I initially got my start mostly doing recording for documentaries. I had a professor one day that just said, I need to record narration for a documentary. I don't feel like doing it, you do it. So that was the first time I tried, and I really enjoyed it. So I kind of stuck around in the audio production space. And then a little later on, after I graduated, I was kind of struggling with finding a job, having enough experience to actually get a job. So I started moving into the podcasting space a little bit. My first show was a Dungeons and Dragons actual play called Dark Dice, working with the team there. And from there, I kind of realized these people don't live in Los Angeles or New York, and they're kind of outside the traditional recording spaces, and kind of realized that there's such a need for remote audio engineering. So with incredible foresight, I guess, I thought, you know what would be good to do in January 2020 is start a business. So I decided to start my business and specialize in remote editing. And honestly, with the pandemic, because I had remote editing experience before, a lot of people reached out to me needing help because their studios closest to them had closed and they needed help with recording, mixing, and mastering. So our anniversary actually is today. So it's turning 4 years old. And that's what I've been doing since 2020.
Well, congratulations and happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And yes, incredible foresight. We didn't see what was coming January 2020. We were hearing hints about it, but this can't be real and this can't be our life. So let's just keep going on with business as usual.
Yeah, exactly.
The American way. And yeah, congratulations. That's really dope that you did have the foresight, but also the experience and desire to support others in their work, because that is one of the main issues of sustainability for podcasters is, oh, I just thought it was the mic. I need to edit this thing and all of that. So having someone with your expertise, and one of the reasons for Afros and Audio in the beginning was to be able to make these connections, is to say, listen, there are audio professionals out in this world. You don't have to do it by yourself. You are not alone. So once again, kudos to you for starting that work and being a part of this industry. What inspired you to establish Hemlock Creek Productions? And what are some of the unique challenges and rewards of running an audio post-production studio? I know you spoke about your inspiration behind it. So what are some of those unique challenges that you find and rewards in running the production company?
Yeah, I would say one of the challenges that has kind of been on my mind since I started has been having to wear every hat, because I have years of experience through school of doing the audio engineering part. And I really expected having more difficult projects, that's going to be the most difficult part, having to do more complicated edits, things like that. And I think what I wish I had realized more before I started, and saying this, it just sounds like such a dumb moment of of course this is true, but I didn't realize how much of my job would be building relationships, networking, talking with clients, those people management skills. So I think I've definitely gotten better since I started, but going from being an audio engineer where someone tells you what to do, hands information to you, and then collects it and hands it to the client is a very different experience than having to find the clients, have negotiations on your contracts, talk about deadlines, realistic expectations, all those things. So I think that has been the interesting challenge to me. But going back to the first part of your question about motivation for starting, something that I also struggled with a little bit was, how do I say this? I guess not having input in those decisions, being told, this is the deadline, you have to make it, things like that. And I found that I struggled a lot with unrealistic expectations and not being able to choose which clients I worked with, things like that, just kind of having things thrown at you. And also in general, too, sometimes being talked down to a little bit. I had multiple people kind of be surprised that this audio engineer is not a man, they're not white. And that experience just kind of became one-off instances you can kind of deal with of like, oh, I'm surprised you know how to run this board. But like, just over time, especially I used to work in concert sound and having like people in the band like not being confident in my skills and just kind of seeing me as like a grunt worker. So I really wanted to kind of take the reins and show like I can actually do this and be like a leader in this industry instead of just, seen as kind of like a grunt worker, I guess, if that makes sense. So I don't want to say it was out of spite, but definitely like I have the motivation here to like run a business and show that this is something I can do.
That's an awesome story. Thank you for sharing it. Something that you said in that answer, who did you want to work with? Did you come out the gate when you started Hemlock and say, I know the type of clients I want to work with. I know the type of projects I want to work with. How did that process go for you? And were you able to maintain that knowing that you also needed business?
Yeah. So initially when I started out, I've always been kind of a ambitious person. So I was very like, oh yes, I'm going to be working on like these AAA video games and Hollywood films and just like trying to imagine that out of the gate. And I have gotten the chance to work on some since I started, especially in the video game space. But I have come to learn that I really like working on indie shows, especially ones that are just starting out and like you can tell that there's just like this incredible passion. The stories that they're telling are really engaging, but they just need that help and support to make themselves sound good. Those are some of my favorites because it's like, I don't know. I really like being a support for people that like, they're like 98% of the way there. They just need some clarity in their work or some help with the editing. So that's been my favorite so far, has been some of these like really small shows that are just starting out and just need a little bit of help.
Nice. All right. So you worked on a variety of projects, as you just mentioned, video games, television, concerts. Could you share some insights or memorable experiences from working on specifically Last of Us, a series or the podcast, Maxine, Miles, and Dark Dice?
Yeah, sure. So The Last of Us, I finished working with Naughty Dog in October. I helped work on The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 remastered. I think that was kind of a unique experience because basically going from college into indie, it was really interesting getting to work on bigger teams, whereas with most of my stuff with Hemlock Creek, it's me and maybe one or two other people. The most it's been was when I worked on my original podcast. I think it was total 25 versus with Naughty Dog. There were at least 30 of us in the audio department and we were just doing audio in addition to having like, I think all total when I was working there were like 400 people there. So it was a really interesting experience going from working mostly solo or with one other person to being on that big of a team. And I feel like I learned a lot in terms of like people management, people skills, working with others that I was able to bring back to Hemlock Creek when I returned. And it's really helped me with my teamwork and expectation management, deadline management, things like that. Maxine Miles was a little bit different. That one wasn't a show that we created, but me and two other people working with Hemlock Creek were brought on to do all the sound for the show. I think at that point, that was probably one of the biggest and most involved shows that we'd worked on. And I think it was also one of the first where I was bringing in other engineers. So it was, again, an interesting experience because I think before that point, I'd been almost completely solo up until then. So it's really interesting. Another thing I hadn't really thought about much of when I was in school, of that teamwork aspect, working together, being able to bounce ideas off each other with other audio professionals, which I really loved. And then Dark Dice, like I mentioned before, that was the very first show that I ever worked on. That experience was a bit unique because I had gone from doing narration for mostly documentaries at that point and was like, well, documentary narration, podcast audio, I'm sure it's pretty similar, right? It ended up not being pretty similar, even though I used a lot of those skills, but it was really great being able to be trusted by the team with my professional expertise through school and working on projects there, to be able to kind of take the reins on that. And I would say that show's probably helped me grow the most in working with the other professionals on that team.
Cool. So when you say that you have learned teamwork and how to manage expectations and that sort of thing, when it comes to your own production work, what has it been like for you to grow Hemlock with the understanding that, or is there an understanding, do you want to have a big team eventually with Hemlock? Is it something that you aspire to do, or you like working solo and delegating and pulling people in per project?
Yeah, so I think if there was ever a point where there was enough consistent work to have people stay on project to project to project, I would definitely do so. There's been one engineer working with me. I think it's been for maybe like 2.5 years now that we've been working together, and she's been coming on for various projects. So I think in an ideal world, it would be nice to have maybe myself and 3 to 4 other engineers constantly working together. I like the idea of having a tight-knit team where everyone knows each other, knows kind of their strengths and weaknesses, and it doesn't feel like anyone's really getting lost in like a massive team. But I would like to see it someday grow to be bigger. I'd also love to have a full-time producer. I think that would be amazing because specifically with my own show, managing, like I said, I think it was 25 people, including myself. We were able to do it and it worked out pretty well, I think, but it just takes so much time and energy to just kind of people manage that I think having someone on the team to handle a lot of the nitty-gritty, like scheduling, deadlines, things like that, where I kind of focus more on the technical audio aspect, would be really great. So I think in an ideal world, it might be like 5-6 engineers total and then a producer.
Okay. Well, I hope for that for you in the very near future. Absolutely. And I definitely understand how administrative stuff takes up so much time. And especially when you are at the helm, people would be surprised of how much work you're doing as your own executive assistant. Right?
Yeah. Infinite emails.
Absolutely. I get it. So you're talking about your podcast, Liars and Leeches, which I have not heard it yet, but I'm very much looking forward to listening to it. So what were some of the key considerations you had to make in terms of audio production to bring this horror audio drama to life?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that I took into mind was both I and the other engineer, Melissa Pons, she did the sound design. We've worked together on a fair amount of projects before and since then, but both of us had worked in video and film before, and audio is really commonly treated as an afterthought. Like you don't get brought in, especially if you're doing post-production editing like we do, you usually don't get brought in until things have already at least started being recorded and possibly things have been wrapped at the point that you get brought on. And there are a lot of things that you run into when that happens where you're like, oh, I wish I'd been around to say like, hey, something about the way that this microphone is being recorded is going to cause problems later, or maybe we could try recording from a different angle or things like that, where just having a quick 5-minute conversation could have saved a lot of time editing and post-production. So what I decided for my show, both me having an audio background and being the creator and writer of the show, plus Melissa having a sound design background, is our process instead was I wrote sort of a bulleted outline of everything that I wanted to include in the show. And then we had a script writer come in and kind of take that, add the dialogue, because I'm good at writing stories, but not dialogue. So they came in and wrote the actual scripts. And then from there, I had both myself reviewing it and Melissa reviewing it, so that even before the script was completely finalized, we'd gone through and made edits of the narrator says that this character is walking here, but we're going to have sound design here so we can scratch the narrator saying that here. And we went through and did that for every episode. And I feel like doing both that and also going through and making recordings of additional sounds we wanted to be recorded. So like sighs, crying, things like that are kind of mentioned in the script but don't have their own lines of dialogue, just making notes on like how many takes we needed, things like that. And it just saves so much time in the recording process. So I basically learned that like something I'd suspected of like if you bring audio people in at the beginning, it's going to make things smoother down the line, and being able to experiment and discover that that was true was a really exciting experience. So I think anytime I make any more shows in the future, it's going to follow a similar pipeline, even though that's not very common in podcasting and media in general.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the extra recording of sound effects. Mm-hmm. There are exhaustive libraries of sound effects, but we find that when we are in the sound design and audio production, there's just some things that don't exist in those catalogs at all. Mm-hmm. And there's an opportunity there, right, to either add to libraries or just create our own. Mm-hmm. And so I love that that's something that you are in tune with, like, yeah, that's not in that library. We got to make it. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Something else that we run into in film a lot, where it's like, oh, I just wish there'd been some alternative takes of like this sniffle or this cough, because you can't just like put a random cough that belongs to someone else in there, because people would notice like maybe not necessarily what happened, but be like, something about that sounded weird. So being able to kind of get ahead of that was really great.
No, that's really cool. So Liars and Leeches has won multiple awards. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What do you think sets it apart in the world of audio dramas, and what has the success meant to you personally and professionally?
Yeah, so I think in terms of setting it apart, there are a lot of excellent horror audio dramas out there. I think probably our pipeline is what helped a lot, because it allowed us to get a lot of those extra details in early. I also think that with both Melissa and I having a background in cinema, we kind of went for a bit more of a cinematic, not fully surround sound, but there's definitely lots of panning going on to try and make the listener feel really immersed in like they're sitting in the room in each situation. So I would say what probably set it apart was that level of detail with the sound design and the voice acting as well too, because all of the voice actors on the show were amazing, but them being able to add those small details. Even I remember in one scene, a character is scared and has to climb up onto the roof of her house, and we recorded for like maybe 10 minutes, just different climbing sounds, you know, kind of like changing the tone slightly. So we had all these different options. So I would say that that's probably what helped us with those awards, just that level of sound design and dialogue detail.
Yeah, and that transferable skill, cinema, that's so awesome. And I taught a class on audio fiction for another company, Alitu, and people were surprised to know that even the sounds that you hear on television or in a movie, a lot of those are made afterwards. If you just listen to someone walking, it would not translate. That sound wouldn't come through. You actually have to do that in post-production. I'm not as versed as you, but I do know that. And people were like, really? That's interesting. I never knew that. So sound design is everywhere. And that need for it is in most mediums that call for it. It's just not what you see. It's a lot of that work behind the scenes. So it's cool that you were able to bring that into your own work. There are a lot of audio dramas out there. And again, I haven't listened to yours yet. Cannot wait. And when I say that, I mean that genuinely. That's the first thing I'm doing after this. And I want you to speak to this. I've seen a few Clubhouse conversations around audio dramas, and I'm not inferring that yours is specifically in a Black genre, but being made by a Black creative and people who are interested in this, but just really don't know, will people get into it? Is horror something that people want to hear? But you created that and you did it well. What made you do the horror?
Yeah, so I've had kind of a long relationship with horror. When I was younger, I used to be like such a scaredy cat, like could barely watch. Even like I remember The Incredibles scared me so bad when I was little. So I eventually got into horror through watching a lot of older horror films from like the 20s, 30s, 40s. So since then, it's definitely my favorite genre. But there's something about it, and I'm sure this probably doesn't come as a surprise, but when as a Black person, seeing Get Out, that was one of the first horror films that I'd seen that had really centered Blackness in a way where Blackness was not seen as either the other or as even like kind of villainy. And I felt really inspired of this idea of taking concepts as a Black person that you face in real life but can't like physically deal with or get rid of. Like you can't like fist fight racism. I wish you could. But the concept of making a physical manifestation of it in a movie and then seeing how characters interact and deal with this like physical manifestation just like felt very inspiring to me. I had kind of a previous history of dealing with a particular gun violence incident and decided to take these feelings of like, how do you, especially as an American, how do you reckon with living your daily life and dealing with this potential threat of gun violence? And it's not something you can physically deal with. So that's kind of what gave me the inspiration of making Liars and Leeches of like, how do I take something that is this like intangible but threatening force and make it into the physical, which is kind of where the show's villain comes into play. This idea of dealing with anxiety, fear, grief, loss.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I really love your approach, and I'm glad that you decided to do horror because it is a genre that people are doing it, but it's not tapped enough, in my opinion. And there is opportunity there and a lane to create and show up in those spaces. And I truly believe that when we show up in certain areas that aren't typical, it creates a possibility for others. So yeah, I, for one, appreciate you for deciding on this genre and moving towards it and creating something amazing from it. So going back to the audio professional work specifically, you mentioned enjoying working remotely. How do you manage the challenges of remote collaboration in audio editing, especially with clients who are new to this process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say one of the biggest things that I've found helps is just kind of managing expectations off the bat. Another thing is just trying to get ahead of problems before they start. I do offer services of like helping clients even like have consultations where they can talk with me before they even start recording, because especially with remote audio recording, sometimes people try to do so over Zoom. They might have one file with everyone's dialogue on it. So just kind of going through and helping people understand how to record remotely to stave off any problems in the future. That's one of the biggest things. In terms of managing it, though, working from home, it's been kind of a journey because, again, I started my business 2 months before the pandemic hit, so there kind of wasn't really another option. But I would say definitely maintaining relationships with people that you work with virtually, because I can't go into an office and just like, have water cooler chit chat or things like that. I would say that's one of the biggest things, because in an office, you kind of slowly build up that rapport with people over time, just like talking about things. So trying to maintain that as well in remote work is challenging sometimes, but really working to build these relationships with people remotely so that it somewhat mirrors like working in an office space. Sometimes that will come through if I'm in the same city as someone that I'm working with, trying to meet up with them in person, things like that. I feel like that really helps the process go a bit more smoothly if we know each other better.
Okay. And when it comes to consulting, some clients know what they want. They're like, I know I want sound design. I know I want the basketball when we're talking about basketball, right? Mm-hmm. Stuff like that. But how do you manage the consulting and educating people on what they don't know? Because there's a lot of that, I'm sure, that you come across.
Yeah, I would say definitely first and foremost, when I'm starting to do a project, we have lots of meetings hashing out expectations. One of the big thing is asking for references from people. If they're like, oh, I really like how this show sounds and want it to sound like this, or this show, their level of sound design is really intense, but I want something a little bit more scaled back. That helps a lot because it's easier for people to explain that they like something and send examples without getting into the nitty-gritty versus just trying to explain it all verbally. So having references is definitely a massive help in that case. I also, when it comes to actually starting on the work, I try to have a much more back and forth type process. So for some of my shows, for example, they'll send notes on where they want things. Like, I want this music here and this music here. I also have, with that back and forth, we'll send working drafts and get feedback from people, because there are times where they'll say maybe like turn this down a bit, or this is a bit intense, we can turn it back, or this isn't intense enough, let's add things here. Because I think in a lot of cases, the expectation is that they just send all their audio to me and it comes back as like this perfect like show just on like step one. But I try to have a lot more of a collaborative process because my idea of intense sound design might be completely different than someone else's intense sound design. So it's a lot more collaborative than I think people think.
Yeah, it has to be. So I definitely get that. In the intake, you emphasize the importance of room acoustics over expensive equipment. Can you offer some practical tips for podcasters on how to improve their recording space?
Yeah, absolutely. And the main reason that I said that is because there are times where people might have, let's just say you have a $500 budget for your show. People might be inclined to spend that $500 just on the microphone. But if there's sounds of cars going by or your roommates like making food in the kitchen, you can hear it in the background of the podcast, that expensive microphone is not going to save you from having all of that background noise in your production. So I would say there are some kind of very simple ones right off the bat of if you have roommates or people you live with, telling them when you're recording, asking for quiet, closing windows and doors, making yourself have like a smaller space. Some of the other tips I would say is that if you have a room with a lot of bare walls, bare floors, that creates a lot of an echo effect. So I would say try to make your space have more soft surfaces. So even if that's hanging towels or tapestries on the walls, or maybe adding an area rug or things like that, those things don't seem like they'd make a huge difference. But even if you've ever been in an apartment or a house that doesn't have any furniture in it and you talk, you can hear like a little bit of an echo. It's very similar in other spaces, even if you do have furniture and things like that in there. But even though you might not be as aware because you're used to your space, the microphone is aware. And especially with more expensive microphones, they pick up a lot more of that detail than lower end microphones. Some of those even have noise cancellation on them. So you might not even realize when you're recording how noisy your space is.
Yeah, absolutely. My wife is going to kill me, but when I'm recording, I'm like, I'm recording, so please don't be a stomposaurus around here. I need you to walk softly. So yeah, I get it. That's great advice. There's so much, right, that goes into it. And when I say so much, your practical tip makes it less complex. It's not that complex, but knowing is, as G.I. Joe used to say, half the battle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's definitely different layers because I think some people, when they think like acoustic treatments, they're like, oh, I'm going to have to rip out my walls or put up this expensive paneling or things like that. And like, that's definitely something you could do, but there are those simpler steps that you can start out right away, as well as mid-tier of like, there are some cheaper acoustic panelings that you can just like hang on your wall. That's a lot easier than just like completely rebuilding your space.
Absolutely. See panels on walls just sticking there.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of continuing on this, because you are the master of sound design, if I can be so bold. And so there are specific sets of tech that you recommend for podcasters. Could you delve into why you chose the particular tools that you have and how they contribute to the quality of a podcast? I know it's a range, so if you want to just be specific or you want to go for it, it's up to you.
Yeah, I would say, man, I kind of have a lot of stuff, but I would say that one of the best investments that I have done has been probably my headphones or my monitors. I'm currently in the process of getting new ones set up, but my old ones were Genelec monitors, and I use Audio-Technica headphones, the M50X headphones. And the Genelec monitors were definitely like much more of a studio type monitor. They were the same ones that we had when I was in school. They give like a pretty crisp, clean sound. But the headphones that I use are a little bit more, how do I say this? They don't give as much detail as some of the monitors. And I like using those when I'm listening to a final mix because they're a lot closer to consumer grade. And I think it's really important. Like, people will create this spectacular mix that sounds amazing on their $1,000 speakers and it sounds wonderful in the studio, but ultimately people are going to be listening probably either on a smart speaker in their car or on consumer grade headphones. So I think having that mix between like really detailed monitors versus having headphones that have a little bit more of a flat response closer to consumer grade is really important. I would say having my audio interface was another important investment. That's how I get all of my recordings if I'm recording from home, but usually I record people virtually. But I have a solid state logic interface, and that's been really helpful. It just has channels for 2 mics. So if I was recording someone else here doing like a podcast with me and another person, it would be great for that. And then I know I mentioned headphones and monitors being a big investment, but I would say by far my biggest investment was actually my computer, because when you're doing audio engineering and podcasting, being able to have a computer that keeps up really, really important. Like there are people that might be recording and their computer crashes or doesn't have enough memory, things like that. So if there's one thing I explored with the most on my audio engineering, I built my computer, and it was definitely the best investment because I can just import so much audio, record so much stuff at the same time, and I don't have issues with it.
Wow, you're saying something there. You just made my whole brain go like, wait a minute, I have a gaming PC and I'm struggling with this laptop. Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. It's one of those things where people are like, I have a great mic and stuff like that. Why am I lagging? Or even in terms of like audio cleanup, because for a long time when I started, because it was right out of college, I just had my little, I think it was an Asus laptop. And when I'd get into tracks with like 40, 50 sessions with a bunch of plugins, it would start crashing a lot. So being able to upgrade with that, I know a lot of podcasts would probably just have like 4 or 5, but even being able to run noise cleanup on it, sometimes it would freak you out. So it helps. It makes a big difference.
Absolutely. This series is a lot of podcast creators, hosts. I don't want them to freak out.
Yeah.
We're talking about someone who is in the profession, that does this work on a regular basis, that needs this level of equipment. Because one of the things that we do notice is that a lot of podcast creators will out the gate have the biggest, best, all these things, and they're like, okay, I don't know what to do with that button. So I'm going to throw it all away, right? And there's levels, you graduate. So keep doing what you're doing, but understand that there is an opportunity. The more invested, the more you get, the more you grow to graduate into different systems and things that you need.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when I started out, it was, my school laptop, pair of headphones. That was pretty much all I had. And I was able to start building Hemlock Creek with just that stuff. And I would also say too that I personally think it's better to get more experience on like the equipment that you have and then graduate up, because especially you'll get into arguments with audio engineers about like headphones and monitors about, which one's better. And it's such a personal experience. Like there are headphones that people consider to be like universally loved that I'm just like, I don't want to use these. So being able to kind of get an ear and learn first and then try out what works best for you is better than just like, well, people say that this one is good, so I'm going to get it. So I'd say like take the recommendations I had with a grain of salt, because it really matters to your ear.
Yeah, thank you. So as a successful professional in the technical field, what advice would you give to aspiring audio professionals, especially women and people of color who are looking to enter and make an impact in this industry?
Yeah, I would say the biggest impact to me is I felt when I started out that I needed very advanced levels of education and experience before I could even really get started at first. But honestly, so much of work in audio is just getting your hands on things and trying. And a lot of the stuff you make when you start out is going to sound bad. I know that when I look at my stuff from like 2014, I'm like, oh man, this is gnarly. So I would say don't feel discouraged by the idea of you have to have the best equipment and all this experience before you even get started, because so much of audio, I didn't take a single class in podcasting when I was in school. That wasn't really an option available to me. And all that I learned about podcasting was YouTube videos, pulling in from other experience that I had. So even if you're practicing doing like sound redesigns or things like that's all experience that's really important. So don't feel like you have to have the best of the best in terms of education and equipment to even get started. It's just so hands-on of kind of trying what works, seeing what doesn't, and going from there. And also feel free to reach out to other people in the industry and ask them questions as well, because I know at least pretty much everyone that I've met has kind of had a similar story of like maybe college, but most people have been self-taught on YouTube and just gotten experience from there.
Absolutely. And the impact, you mentioned earlier walking into a space and being ready to work, and people were like, that can't be who we were waiting on. Right. And so talk about that impact that you think you have personally made in the industry and the importance of representation in the industry.
Yeah, I think representation is incredibly important. And I don't think I quite realized the extent of how much representation was needed until I think it was either my junior or senior year in college. My school started the Women in Audio group, and we would go around and do advocacy. Usually it was like high school job fairs, but sometimes it would get all the way down to elementary school level. And I remember doing a fair once in this neighborhood in the city that I went to school in. Most of the kids were probably like 6 to 8, and I would say most of them were Black. And I remember this little girl, we kind of did an experiment where we were recording their voices and like adding a beat to it so they could like hear themselves making music. And this one little girl said, I didn't think that this is something that I could do. And I don't know if she was referring more to like being a girl, being young, but like she just hadn't even like fathomed this as a potential career path. And I remember that really stuck with me because at least I felt growing up, this is what I want to do, I'm going to do it. And I've just kind of always been like that. But this idea that there's so many Black people, so many women that just don't think they can do this because they don't belong in the space. And I think that advocacy, at least for me, is really important, of kind of being out and very visible in this space so other people feel it's, I don't know, they're not alone kind of joining this industry. So that's why I kind of try to be visible and talk about my experiences a lot, because I think about that little girl a lot and hope that maybe she got into music, maybe not, but letting people see that it's possible for them to do.
Absolutely. And thank you for recognizing that and being representation inside of this industry. I want to ask you, I noticed a lot this past year and maybe the last 2 years, a lot of audio professionals have taken a hit inside of the industry itself, from layoffs to just unable to find work. Maybe there's a lack of importance on the production company or the industry itself than in audio professionals and the work that you all contribute, the very necessary work. But what would you say to that audio professional that is on the verge right now? Like, well, this isn't what I signed up for, or I thought it was going to be easier, or why isn't it working out, or why am I the first to get laid off? Those type of things that come up for people in all industries in different mediums. But my heart goes out to those audio professionals that I saw posting and just really feeling really down about the industry itself. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say, as someone that's also been kind of recently affected by some of those layoffs and kind of had like similar thoughts going through my head of, is this kind of what the audio industry is? I think that I would say that there's a very big difference between, how do I say this? Audio engineering as a whole versus audio engineering for certain groups. And I think that because these bigger corporations are the most visible, that it's kind of like a, I guess the word's like confirmation bias, that because these big visible groups are having these issues, that the whole industry is like that. And I would say my advice would be to really get out there, look at other smaller studios, independent audio engineers, things like that, because this industry is way bigger than it seems. It seems like there's only like a few options of places that you can go. And there's just so much storytelling out there, so many podcasts, so many games, shows, things like that. I think when people don't find luck in kind of these bigger spaces, they feel like, well, that's supposed to be the best of the best. Like, where am I go from here? I would say if you're able to try attending like a film festival or some sort of festival, there are so many that are just online, and just getting inspiration from there, because there are so many people out there looking for engineers or making really awesome things in this independent space, that it feels really motivating and exciting to see how big this industry actually is. So I would say even if you've been hit with these layoffs, just get out there and look beyond some of those bigger companies. And at least personally, I've found a lot of success in the indie space, and there's just so much creativity and excitement going on over here. So come to the indie side, take a look.
Absolutely. And beyond that, and adding on to that, you created your own. You created your own company. You created your own creative outlet in Liars and Leeches. So there's something to be said about that too, is that relying so much on the outside world when there are things that you can create for yourself and and create opportunities for yourself as well. Mm-hmm. So again, congratulations on all that you've done. I'm really looking forward to everything that you've got moving forward. I know that you're not just getting started, but there's a lot more to come that I can just sense.
I hope so. Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So finally, what's next for you and Hemlock Creek Productions? Are there any upcoming projects or initiatives that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, so I think the main thing that I'm looking forward to is doing Liars and Leeches Season 2. We're still kind of in the pre-production phases of that. I'm not quite sure when Season 2 will be released, but I'm very much looking forward to kind of getting my hands back on it again. We're working on some other projects in the works that I can't talk about right now, but I'm excited to share them when they come out. And then the last thing I think has been impactful actually has been how social media has changed recently, just because there's been a lot of changes, especially to Twitter, or people deciding that they want to spend more time offline. So we're going to be releasing a newsletter starting soon, I'm hoping in the next couple of weeks, just kind of really spotlighting some of our work, spotlighting some of the creators that we've worked with, as well as some of the projects some of our other actors and creatives have been working on. So I'm really excited. This would be my first newsletter ever, but I'm excited to more directly talk about audio work and some of the projects that we've been working on in greater detail than on social media.
Okay, great. And in this moment, are you solely focused on the podcast world? Are you still working in video games and TV and film?
Yeah, so at least at the moment, all of my projects that I'm currently working on are podcasts, but I'm definitely open to working on film or video games. It's just a lot easier to manage multiple podcasts at once versus video games, but be very open to getting back into the video game space again.
Awesome. That was just a curious question. I'm a video game fiend. I've played The Last of Us 1 and 2 probably 3 to 4 times through. So yeah, that's how obsessed I am. So that's really exciting that you worked on those for me. And I'm sure for others that are a fan of the game and the video game genre in general. So that's exciting. How can people find you online?
Yes. So my business's website is hemlockcreekprod.com. That's prod.com. So that's the main way that people can reach out. There's a contact form on there that goes directly to my email. So if people want to talk to me, they can reach out through there. I'm also on social media, pretty much every social media, as either Sassy Composer or The Sassy Composer. So you can reach out to me through there as well, but I tend to respond a little bit faster through email. And then Liars and Leeches has its own website. It's just liarsandleeches.com, and it has links to where you can listen to all the episodes, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, things like that.
Okay, awesome. And are you currently sourcing clients? You said you do consulting. What should people know wanting to reach out to you to work with you?
Yeah, so I definitely still have space to work on current projects. I'm open to podcast, film, or video games right now. And then I also do consulting, or I guess it's a type of consulting, but podcast audio audits, where I can listen to your podcast audio, or if you're thinking about starting to record, I can listen to recordings from each person that's going to be on the show and just kind of give advice, opinions, things you might be able to improve before you start recording.
Okay. I am going to close this out. Thank you for sharing all of that. It's been a pleasure meeting you, but one thing came across my mind as you were closing out, and I wanted to know what you think about AI. And have you begun to incorporate that into any of your processes or workflow for efficiency? Have you started using AI?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's kind of tricky to say because AI has become like such a broad term, I guess, at this point, that like it's kind of hard to know like what people are talking about. When it comes to using AI to generate voices, I do not, because I feel like a lot of those generators pull from people that may not have given their consent. So I don't use any type of voice generators or anything for my podcast. There are a couple tools that previously labeled themselves as machine learning or like smart tools, like Isotope RX. That one's like the industry standard for noise reduction and has been for probably at least a decade, if I had to guess. So I do use Isotope still. I have kind of mixed feelings about them rebranding to say that it's AI, but I guess now they're saying it's AI. So I do use that for noise reduction. But in terms of any AI that creates audio, I do not.
Got it. Thank you. It's a topic of discussion. So I wanted to make sure that we talked about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I have a lot of opinions, but that would probably be a whole other episode.
Absolutely. We'll come back and we'll have our conversation about it. But once again, Marisa, it's been great meeting you. It's been great talking to you about the work that you have done and will continue to do. I'm super excited. I will be reaching back out to you as soon as I'm done with Liars and Leeches. I can't wait. So if you have nothing else, then I'll close us out.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you again for having me. This was fun.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I want to give a big thanks to our Afros in Audio and Black Podcast Association members for supporting our commitment for community and collaboration. If you'd like to join the Black Podcasters Association, the link will be in the description. And if you want to join us at the 6th Annual Afros in Audio Podcast Festival, visit afrosinaudio.com. Follow at Afros in Audio on all social media channels, and you can find and follow me at Talib Jasir on Instagram. Thanks again, Marisa, for being a part of Afros in Audio's Black History Month interview series.